Coming up, I discuss some of the really positive and important contributions that anti-racist literature and thinking has made to my journey through this whole topic of race and justice in our society. And I also wrap up this particular video series with some of my thoughts about where we might be able to go from here. So I hope that you find this, at minimum, I hope you find it thought-provoking and interesting, and it prompts your own further reflection on this really important topic. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, so if you've been tracking with me at all through this short video series that I've been doing, you'll know, particularly in the third video, the one right before this, you'll know that I leveled some pretty strong critiques, particularly at what I see as the popular, harsher, kind of farther left progressive form of anti-racism in our culture right now. And those critiques are important, and I think I'm genuinely troubled by some of what I see going on in that. And so that's all remains true, but what I want to do in this video is bring some balance to those critiques by talking about some of the positive contributions that this whole journey has provided for me. Because part of the problem in especially topics like this one that are so charged, rhetorically charged, especially right now, part of the problem is a temptation to pendulum swing in a reactionary way. So any critique, pegs someone as being anti the entire way of thinking, and vice versa. And that's not what I want to do. That's not where I'm at. I'm not anti-reactionary, I don't think. And I don't want to encourage that way of processing and that way of thinking about this whole topic either. So that's why I wanted to follow up with this video, which this will be the final installment, at least in this particular series of videos in terms of my personal journey. Because I want to share, I just want to share how some of this has impacted me in a positive way. So hold those critiques in your mind still. If you haven't watched that video, you might want to watch that before watching this, as I'm going to build off of it. But what I'd like to do in this discussion is, in this video, I'd like to explore one very significant tension, not contradiction. That's an important, I talked a lot about contradictions in the last video. This I see as a tension. There's an important nuance there for me. There's a tension underneath this whole topic of race and justice in our society. And that tension, I believe, is this. Hang with me, I'm gonna unpack this, but it might sound weird at first. But the tension is that race, on the one hand, is fake. By that I mean race has been made up by people arbitrarily, really, as a way to categorize humans. It has no basis in any sort of empirically observable reality. Like we can't link racial categories to anything biological. We just can't. So it's fake in that sense. On the other hand, race is very real because it's had very real and extremely damaging and destructive societal impact, really to untold millions of lives. And so this tension, hold this tension in your mind. Race is fake, it's made up, it's arbitrary, but race is also real and has had very, very real and very observable social impact. That tension, I really believe that tension is underneath everything that's going on. I don't think that explains everything, but I really think that tension it produces a lot of what's happening in our cultural discourse and everything right now. So what I want to do in this video is point to some ways that anti-racism and the literature and the thinking and all of that, anti-racism can be very helpful to pointing us back to that tension. And it's helped me in my journey. It's helped me discover that tension and clarify what's going on there. And so I want to talk about that tension through history and then justice, and how anti-racism has helped me see these things a little more clearly, and in a really important way, and an important way that I'm not dismissing or rebuking now that even though that I still have some very real concerns and critiques with some of the popularized forms of anti-racism scholarship. So let's step through this through the lens of history and then justice, and then I'll give some final thoughts. So in terms of history, the historical work in anti-racism and race theory and critical race theory and all that stuff, the historical work there, some of it is extremely good. And so I've already mentioned a few of these thinkers in previous videos, but people like Nell Painter, whose book, The History of White People, is really excellent, and then two theologians named Willie Jennings and J. Cameron Carter. And you can actually see J. Cameron Carter's book here right behind me. I'm pointing at it, Race, A Theological Count. It's a masterful book. It's amazing. But these three, for me, these three thinkers, there's others too, but these three kind of rise to the top in terms of personal impact for me. They've really, in their historical work particularly, have really helped me see more clearly the fake, arbitrary, constructed nature of race as a construct, as a doctrine, as a system. And I've already hinted at this, but what that means and why that's so important to see is to recognize that a few things. Race, as we understand it, and by that I mean racial categories like white, black, Asian, these categories are part of a doctrine in anthropology, a system that really was made up just a couple centuries ago. It's not actually very old. One of the, J. Cameron Carter points to Immanuel Kant in the late 1700s as one of the first scholar intellectuals to talk about racial categorizations of humanity in some of his work, but this is the late 1700s, and it's not coincidental that this way of thinking started to emerge as, really as the two hemispheres of the globe started to interact with each other. The age of colonization, which is part of Willie Jennings' work, gave rise to this way of people encountering entirely new continents and people groups that they weren't even aware of before. And then this system of categorizing humans starts to come up in the wake of that. It's not surprising if you start to see some of those historical connections, which these anti-racist historical scholars are extremely helpful at pointing that out. And this is so important because it's really, really important to see the arbitrary nature of this whole way of thinking about humanity. I mean, the whole way of giving subcategories of humanity in racial terms is, it's socially constructed. It's made up. We built it. We humans built it, and then we used very, very, very pseudo-shallow science to support it. The church and theology systems have been complicit in supporting this way of thinking about humanity. But just this whole thing has been built over a couple centuries, and it was made up. It has no bearing in actual biological. There's just no biological categories that can map over these racial categories. And so to be racist, in a sense, is to believe that these racial categories are significant and important to hold on to. That's kind of the cleanest, clearest definition of racist that at least that I can see and come up with. And being able to see this in the way it's been built historically has been crucial for me in my journey. And so these thinkers, these anti-racist thinkers, have done more than almost anybody to help me get there. And I think that's extremely important. It's extremely important to see racial categorizations as historically recent and made up, and the way they've been supported over the centuries by really unjust systems, particularly to perpetuate the slave trade, which is a huge piece of Western history and American history in particular. So that's extremely important. So in the lens of history, seeing the arbitrary fake nature of race is something that's been afforded to me. I'm grateful for anti-racism for that. And then that starts to link into the justice piece, which also links to the, even though race is fake, race is also real piece. Because here's the reality, the tragic unjust reality is that these racial doctrines, which they weren't, by the way, this is important too, they weren't neutral or horizontal in the sense that, we just see different races and different cultures. It wasn't that, it was hierarchical in the sense, and this is well documented, it was hierarchical in the sense that there are there's a superior category of race, which was the Anglos, the whites, is what it would eventually become. And they were at the top, and the sub-Saharan Africans were consistently placed at the bottom. So it wasn't just a benign way of categorizing humans, which we can think of cultural kind of awareness and international multicultural awareness. That can be a little more benign in this sense, but this racial doctrines was hierarchical. And it's really, really important to recognize that too. And that's where terms like white supremacy get bandied around so frequently today. We can almost lose the sense of what they actually mean because they get talked about so much. But white supremacy historically really meant categorizing humans in racial categories and then placing whites at the top of the hierarchy as the most intelligent, the most culturally sophisticated, all of that stuff. had the Anglo whites in this history were placed at the top because they were believed to have the most human capacity for intellect and good and all of that. That's how it worked, and that is really what white supremacy means, is to hold on to that hierarchical understanding of racial categorization. So this is all super important. It's all super important for us to understand, and it was eye-opening and paradigm shifting for me, and I only had that impact because of these thinkers. So now I went a little bit of a rabbit trail back to that, but that's important because the reality is then that these racial doctrines and these categorizations have had very deleterious, very destructive social real impact on real people. The slave trade is one of the most obvious. In American history, things like Jim Crow, things like debt peonage and sharecropping. Douglas Blackmon's book, Slavery by Another Name, is really good on a period of history on this. Edward Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, which is right there, right behind me, right there it is, it is really good on the economics of capitalism and how slavery kind of entangled with that. A contrarian voice in some of this that's also really good is Thomas Sowell, who pushes back on some of this narrative, but is really good at articulating the place of the Atlantic slave trade in global history. Race and Culture is a really good book by him on that. So anyways, all that to say, these racial doctrines got constructed, they got built, and then societal institutions cooperated with these racial doctrines to build societies and to interact with the building of societies along these racial doctrine lines in such a way as to be extremely unjust as we look back on it, and placing categories of people at the bottom of the hierarchy and then building laws and policies. Jim Crow is a very obvious one. Vagrancy laws are a very obvious one in American history. The ways Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, tracks how particularly in housing policies, how these racial doctrines cooperated with who was able to get certain funds for homes and who wasn't, and how these things built the segregation of our cities and concentrated particularly black, poor people in certain areas of cities. So that this stuff is all extremely important. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really analyzes the war on drugs policies and how these have some entanglement with some of these racial hierarchical ideas, and at least the legacy of those ideas seems to be perpetuated in the disparities of how the war on drugs has impacted particularly poor black communities. So these things are all very important ways to see how the real application of racist hierarchies historically has had real impact on the ground to real people. And that's something that can't be and shouldn't be minimized in our attempt. If we all can agree, I think probably everyone can agree that the building of a more just society is the goal, right? Wherever you land on all these different interpretations of history, if we all want to build a more just society, understanding the ways that we have had unjust policies and unjust societal issues, part of that can be accounted for by race and racial doctrines and the ways that American history in particular has been entangled with some of this stuff. It cannot be minimized out of our analysis. By that I mean we cannot completely gloss over race. It's really tempting to try to only look at it in terms of class, only look at it in terms of economics, or only look at it in terms of culture, or only look at it in terms of responsibility and meritocracy. Those are all really tempting things, and all of those things have a place. There's a way to analyze history through all of those things, but I just don't think we can remove race from that whole complicated social analysis. We don't have the luxury of doing that because of the history and because of the unjust application of racial and racist ideas in our history. So that's a little bit about how, yes, race is fake, and the historical work in anti-racism has helped me see the arbitrariness of race, but race is also real and has had real unjust application and effect and impact on millions of lives in our society, and anti-racist thinkers like the books I just listed a few minutes ago, with the exception of Thomas Sowell. I don't think he would fit in that category, but the other books I listed, Rothstein, Alexander, and such, they've helped me see that too. So these anti-racist literature and scholarship has been crucial in helping someone like me, and I know others, see the fake nature of race as a construct, but also the unjust nature of its real life application and impact in our world. And these are extremely, extremely important things to understand about our history and about what is unjust about what's going on in our culture right now. And so to the extent that anti-racism has helped see those things, it's crucial, and it needs to be at the table, so to speak. These voices need to be heard. But that loops me back to that fundamental tension, that race is fake, but race is also real. That's a really crucial tension at the heart of all of this. And that points me now to, having said all of that, that points me to a couple thoughts about where I think we can and maybe need to go from here. And I'm going to say right up front that my conclusion here is going to be unsatisfying to probably some people, because honestly, my conclusion, in a sentence, my conclusion is that it's complicated. And that's unsatisfying. That's not because it's not simple. My conclusion is that these two things are very real, that race is fake, but race has also had real impact. Those can't be flattened out and simplified. It's complex. It is complicated. These ideas leave a complicated legacy, and a very complicated, unjust legacy. And the effort to unwind the real societal destructive impact of race and racist ideas means we need to take account for it. But then the effort to empty race and racial constructs and racial labels, to empty those of meaning and significance, to get back to the recognition that it was a fake idea to begin with, it was a made-up idea to begin with, that had no basis in reality. Like, we have to take an honest account of what's been done, but then work towards emptying it of meaning, emptying racial categorizations of meaning. And the way to do that is extremely complicated and cannot be, I can't sum it up in a couple minutes in the closing of a YouTube video series. But what I can say is that I do think there's something about allowing room for it to be complicated that is extremely important in our cultural moment. And I'll say a little bit about that. That has to do with my own journey. And I think that other people, particularly if you grew up like me, can maybe relate to. Because here's the reality. Someone like me, who grows up in America, and the time and the place and the cultural location that I did as a white person, you grow up having inherited a lot of cultural advantages and comforts. So being in that racial categorization, as a result of all the stuff I just talked about, means you don't need to think about race if you grow up in the setting I grew up. Yeah, I never really thought about my race, my racial identity at all growing up. There was a kind of a benign obliviousness to it. I just didn't think about it. And when someone who, like me, grows up in that setting, then they get introduced to all of the race, history, injustice, all of that stuff, get introduced to all of it later in life, as I did, as I tracked in some of my earlier videos. Suddenly, the introduction to all those ideas, it complicates reality. The reality that I thought I was living in, had basically not much to do with race or thinking about race. And then suddenly I realized, wait a minute, race has actually played a big role in history and even in the structures that I inhabit today. And so suddenly reality gets complicated for someone like me. And now here's the tension. Anytime reality gets complicated, whether it's through race or economics or any other just growing in knowledge of the world, as you grow in knowledge of the world and the world gets more complicated than you thought it was, the temptation, especially if you occupy a culturally advantaged or privileged position like me, the temptation is always going to be to get back to where it was comfortable and simple. That's always the temptation. And so when someone like me gets introduced to these anti-racist ideas, the world gets complicated, and the temptation is going to be the impulse, the very human, very understandable impulse, is to make things simple and understandable again. There's a choice at that point. The choice can be either to rebuke and disregard all these anti-racist ideas you just heard, or it's to flip the script, to imbibe them, and then to make the world simple again, but through the lens of race and anti-racism. Insofar that then everything becomes about race, all the time, race becomes the only way to analyze injustice, and race becomes the answer to everything. And this is part of what we see, what I see in some of these far, I think I use the term fundamentalistic approach towards anti-racism. And by fundamentalisms, which show up in religion all the time, are really, and ideologies is the other word I used, they're a way of really forcibly simplifying complex things. And so here's what I want to say. To the extent that anti-racism and anti-racist scholarship and rhetoric and literature and all of that, to the extent that it helps, especially people who are unaware of all this stuff, but to the extent that it helps people like me face the realities of historical injustices, face the arbitrary nature and social constructions of race, to the extent that it illuminates all those things and points us to the complications therein, it's crucial. It's important. We need to continue to give it a seat at the table in the marketplace of ideas. It needs to be there. It's important, extremely important. But to the extent that it goes a step farther and then replaces a simplistic understanding of our world, social analysis, with another simplistic understanding of social analysis, to the extent that it goes in that direction, there's just going to be more damage done. I just think there's going to be more damage done because these ideas, analyzing what's wrong in our society, what's unjust, and important, how to build better policies to fix it, to move towards a more just society, towards a society in which this fake arbitrary racial doctrine doesn't hold power anymore, to move in that direction is very complex and very complicated. And we do best, I think we do best to resist the urge to overly simplify it, especially when you add in a dose, as I talked about in the last video, when you add in a dose of a moral certainty. Thomas Sowell calls it a moral melodrama. When you add in that layer of it, it does start to have, I think, very concerning impact in society. And I have the same concerns when I see that same, I'm a pastor, I'm a Christian minister. When I see these same dynamics happen in religion, which they do, I have the same concerns. It's very worrying, and so there's a lot of common concerns there. So here's what I want to say. I want to wrap this all together. For my money, one of the best and easiest to read and helpful and important books on this tension, this race is fake, race is real tension, is by a guy named Thomas Chatterton Williams. And I want to kind of end this series by highly commending this book. It's called Self-Portrait in Black and White. It's a memoir. He is a writer brilliant writer, first of all, just a really moving memoir. It's beautifully written. But he grew up black, always identified as black, was always very proud of being black, and grew up assuming he would raise his children to also be proud of being black. And he's American. And he actually ended up marrying a white woman. And when she gave birth to their first child, who was a daughter, he saw his new daughter, who was born blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and it really unsettled his entire conception of seeing the world through this lens of race. And it's an amazing book, and it doesn't give short shrift to the complications, and that's part of why I love it so much, is he points us back towards these complications that exist and that we need to allow room for. So I'd highly commend that book to anyone who's interested in this journey that we've been on. And I actually want to end on pointing to Scripture, which, if you're not a Christian, just hang with me. It's only going to take a minute. But there's a parable in the New Testament that Jesus teaches, and this parable has nothing to do with race and social injustice. But I think I've been thinking about it a lot. And this parable is the parable of the wheat and the tares. The wheat and the tares. Tares are a plant that look a lot like wheat, but they're actually a noxious plant. They're a noxious weed. And in the parable, as Jesus is teaching this parable, he says that there was a farmer who had a wheat field. And overnight, the enemy of this farmer, unbeknownst to him, scattered seeds of tares through the field. And the tares started to grow up in such a way that they were indistinguishable from the wheat. And the temptation of the farmer's workers was to go out and try to rip up all the tares. But in the process of doing that, they would run the risk of ripping out all the wheat and the good crop as well. And so Jesus says to his followers, let the wheat and the tares exist in the field, lest you try to fix it and you make things worse. And I've been thinking about this parable a lot because of the complications that I think that we really need to allow to exist in this conversation so that we can build a more just society. Letting the complications exist, letting things be real and complicated helps us have a more accurate vision of what is actually happening. And that, I think, is how we can really build a more anti-racist, just society. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you for going along this journey with me, and let me know what you think.